Hello everybody, myself Dr. Shivakumar B. Surapur, Associate Professor, Department of Education, Karnataka State Akkamadavi Women's University, Vijaypura, Karnataka State. You can see my name as a Dr. Shivakumar B. Surapur to watch my YouTube video lessons. And please don't forget to subscribe it. Today we shall study CTE, Certificate Course in Teaching English Language from IGNOU. In that, CTE-01 and Block 3, that is Unit 9, Learning Language Theories. In this, we shall study the Behaviorist Learning Theory, in that classical conditioning, operant conditioning, verbal learning, and mentalist or cognitive approach, and the procedural approach, in that the structure of the child's linguistic input, the child's cognitive organization of language, and the developmental interaction approach. Common sense tells us that when a person is engaged in teaching a particular subject, he or she must have some knowledge about that subject and must also know the language in which the subject is taught. A chemistry teacher must know chemistry, and a geography teacher should know geography. But what about a language teacher? What kind of knowledge is he or she expect to have? So it is necessary that a language teacher must have a good command of the language which he she is teaching. But is that enough? It obviously is not, or else any native speaker of language should be able to teach it. Just internalized knowledge of the language is not enough. He or she must have explicit knowledge about the language, that is, the rules of language and how they are acquired by the human brain. The major learning theories that had an effect on teaching methodology and testing in the 20th century are the behaviorist, the mentalist, and the developmental interactionist. Let us take one by one. So, the first one, the behaviorist learning theory. Behaviorism is exactly what the term implies, a descriptive framework for behavior and exclusively observable behavior. Behaviorist ideas about language learning are based on a theory of learning in which the focus is mainly on the role of environment, both verbal and non-verbal. Let us take a stimulus response. Henceforth, it is coded as capital letter S, hyphen, and capital letter R theory. The basic premise of behaviorism considers learning as an orderly and predictable series of observable behavior patterns, with one of its key concepts being habit formation. A connection is established between a stimulus, that is denoted by S, capital letter S, and the organism's response. The response denoted by capital letter R to this stimulus. In behaviorist psychology, the emphasis is on behavior which may be learned by both humans and animals, because the theory has to explain the behavior of all animate beings. No allowance is made for such non-observable human attributes as plans, attitudes, etc. SR theory identifies two major classifications of learning, that is classical conditioning and instrumental or operant conditioning. Now let's take classical conditioning. The Russian psychologist Pavlov was the first to formulate the conditioned response. It is denoted as capital C and R principle. This principle stems from the possibility of exploiting natural tendencies of an organism to respond in specific ways to stimuli. A stimulus being anything which elicits or calls forth a response of observable behavior. Salivating of the dog at the sight of food, jerking of the knee in response to a lap below the knee, blinking in response to a flash of light, or all natural reflexes or responses present without prior learning. These are referred to as unconditioned reflexes. That is denoted in English capital U and R, in the sense that they are inborn or spontaneous. According to the classical conditioning theory, if a second stimulus is frequently presented just before or simultaneously with the unconditioned stimulus, then this second stimulus presently comes to elicit the same response. This second stimulus is then referred to as a conditioned stimulus, in the sense that the organism's reaction to it has to be conditioned or learned. In the new famous Pavlovian experiments, a dog was presented food and it responded by salivating, that is unconditional response. Then each time that the food was presented, a bell was sounded, that is called as conditioned response. Eventually, the bell elicited the response of salivation. Now coming to the operant conditioning. A somewhat more complicated and more widely applicable learning theory is termed operant or instrumental conditioning. These principles were largely developed by the American psychologist B.F. Skinner and represent to some extent a break from the classical stimulus response models, as we have discussed a couple of seconds ago. Skinner proposes two kinds of responses, elicited and emitted. Responses elicited by known stimuli he calls respondents. Responses emitted without direct reference to known stimuli he calls operants. The operant is postulated as more significant in human learning than the respondent. These responses are called thus because they operate on the environment. In his experiment, a rat was placed in a dark box with a lever. Each time the lever was pressed, a food pellet dropped. Initially, the rat presses the lever accidentally as it moves around the box. Then when it realizes that on pressing the lever it gets food, it learns to operate by pressing the lever, thus obtaining food. When the rat now presses a lever, for example, it has changed the state of the environment but its response are operant. The objective of the operant conditioning procedure is simply to increase the frequency of the response so that the rat presses the lever more often on the basis. So you have seen how the rat has made an experiment. On the basis of this type of animal behavior, Skinner defined notion of reinforcement. If a certain action repeatedly leads to a positive or negative result, the odds of recurrence or non-recurrence of this action will increase. Skinner speaks of positive reinforcement. If the action recurs more frequently, and negative reinforcement if the action is not repeated. In respondent or classical conditioning, the reinforcement is correlated with the stimuli. In operant conditioning, on the other hand, the reinforcement is correlated with response. When an operant has been emitted naturally, it is reinforced by reward, that is, the naturally emitted desired behavior is reinforced. Now, let us see verbal learning. From the observation, systematization and prediction of animal responses to stimuli in laboratory experiments, Skinner drew certain conclusions about human behavior. To Skinner, a theory of language learning should be derived from a general behaviorist learning theory. In the case of language, behaviorism implies that a speaker's performance or his or her responses can be traced back to specific stimulus response relationships. Thus, in a simple behaviorist theory, each utterance follows on some sort of verbal or non-verbal stimulus which exists in the environment, and further it will be reinforced by the behavior of others. In fact, according to Skinner, language behavior could only be studied through observation of the world around the language user. That is, through observation of external factors. One important external factor in the language learning process is the frequency with which a certain utterance is used in the child's environment. In the behaviorist view, children imitate the language of their environment to a considerable degree, and imitation is a strong contributing factor in the language learning process. Therefore, the frequency with which words and structure occurs in the language of the environment will influence the language development of the child. In addition, reinforcement is also required to acquire higher degree of language proficiency. This reinforcement or reward could be due to parental approval or the approval of the other people in the environment. For Skinner, verbal behavior is only one part of the general universally employed learning process. Since he does not differentiate between language behavior and other forms of behavior, it implies therefore that for him language is not species, that is specific. So this is how Skinner has given a very good explanation about the how the language acquisition takes place. Now let us see the mentalist or cognitive approach. Chomsky in 1959, in an extensive discussion of Skinner's verbal behavior, attacked the behaviorist ideas of language learning. Chomsky argued that human behavior is much more complex than animal behavior. Moreover, human language behavior is too complex to be explained through animal behavior. According to Chomsky, A description of language behavior cannot be merely a matter of stimulus and response, but of the innate ability of human beings to learn language. He posited the notion of a language acquisition device, or which is called as LAD, which enables the child to make hypotheses about the structure of language in general and about the structure of language it is learning particular also. This is not a conscious process but a subconscious one. The hypothesis that the child subconsciously sets up are tested in its use of language and matched with new linguistic input that it receives by listening to what is said in its immediate environment. Therefore, a child's language constantly changes as it develops its rule system until he or she develops adult like proficiency. This view of the language learning process lays stress on the cognitive activities of the language learner and minimizes the importance of such external factors as imitation, frequency of stimulus, reinforcement. Some of arguments that were given to the dismiss the behaviorist position and highlight the mentalist one were the following. Number one, the behaviorist reduced language learning to imitative behavior. However, we are aware that children's utterances, I mean, how they use the language, that is we denote as utterances, deviate considerable from the language used by adults. These deviations, furthermore, are systematic. Systematic deviations from the language of adults are strong evidence against any theory which states that language learning is due to imitation. For example, children overgeneralize the irregular past tense forms and plural formation, despite the fact that adults use the correct forms, like good, tell, comed, Moses, mans. Function words are quite frequent in adult language use. Example, article, a, an, three. I mean, definite and indefinite articles. Nevertheless, they do not emerge until quite late in the language development of the child. Now, let us see the procedural approach. The debate between the behaviorist and the mentalist focused on certain important issues in the learning process. Nevertheless, there are problems with both the theories. While the behaviorist ignored the contribution of the child itself in the learning process, the mentalists have practically denied the role of that linguistic input and environment play in this process and have generally paid very little attention to the actual course that language development takes. In the procedural approach to language development, which is much more recent, the interaction between internal and external factors becomes much more central. The starting point in this approach, which remains a mentalistic one, is the child's cognitive capacity to discover structure in the language which is spoken around him or her. Both the child's comprehension and production of language are based on a continuously expanding, changing, and adapting system of discovery procedures. In order to explain the output of the child, two questions have to be dealt with. What is the structure and function of input that the child receives? And second question, what does the child's cognitive organization consist of? that it causes these differences between input and output. Let us take the structure of the child's linguistic input. In the mentalist approach to language learning, it was believed that the linguistic input that a child received was completely unstructured. There was no difference between what was said to children and what was said to adults. However, recent studies, that is after 1970, have shown that there are considerable differences between the way adults speak to children and the way they speak to each other. Adult child speech is much more structured and simple than adult adult speech. For example, if you take into account as per uh, D. Willers and D. Willers, the difference between the adult child as well. That means how they uh, discuss adult adult and adult child. Let us see the type of difference. I mean phonological differences. Higher pitch observations are like this: higher pitch and exaggerated intonation, clear enunciation, slower speech, and distinct pauses between utterances, phonological simplification, distinct constant vowel combinations. And next, syntactic differences: shorter and less varied utterance length, sentences mostly well formed and intelligible, many partial complete repetitions of own or child's utterances, sometimes with expansion, fewer broken sentences, fewer verbs per utterance, fewer coordinate or subordinate clauses, fewer embeddings, more content words and fewer function words, subject nouns or pronouns and auxiliary in yes or no questions were detected. Now, how this are takes place? What is the nature of language learning here? More imperatives and questions to young children, increasing number of declaratives with increasing age of child. And what are the semantic differences? More limited vocabulary use, reference invariably to the here and now words, have concrete reference, and there are few references to the past. More limited range of semantic relations. And what about pragmatic differences? More directives, imperatives, and questions. Now comes the child's cognitive organization of language. There are as yet no detailed models for the description of children's cognitive organization of language. However, Slobin in 1973, on the basis of data from a large number of unrelated languages, formulated a number of operating principles for child language acquisition. Clark and Clark have recorded and reformulated these operating principles. Let us see some of the operating principles. Number one, children look for systematic modification in the form of words. This principle helps children to grasp the fact that word stems may be slightly modified to express important differences in meaning. For example, preach, preacher, monkey, monkeys, monkeys, banana. And second one, children will look for overt cues for underlying meaning. For instance, child will use the book which that he read. Before the book he read, Similarly, children use I would before I would. Third one, children avoid exceptions for the rule. As we discussed couple of seconds ago, children tend to use the regular role for even the irregular or special causes. For example, breaked for broke, good for went, comed for came, mans for men, mouses for mice, sheeps for sheep. Now, fourth one, children pay attention to the order of words, prefixes, and suffixes. This principle helps children to keep track of the order of elements within words and the order of words within sentences. Children learning English rarely, if ever, make mistakes like is, fish, head, play, toy, the. So these are the mistakes what we'll observe oftenly when the child goes for pronouncing and using the language. Now let us see how the developmental interaction approach helps in acquisition of language learning. Language acquisition models which developed in America from the 1930s to the mid 1950s had their roots in the association theory of psychology. Around the same time, however, language acquisition theories deriving from other traditions within psychology were developing. These originated from European psychology and psychoanalytic thinking, and they often viewed a language from an entirely different perspective than that of the American behaviorist. Among the most well known and influential of these theorists was the Swiss psychologist, that is Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget's work deals with the developmental sequence of stages in cognitive development. His developmentality oriented theory displays a much broader scope than that of the behaviorist. He has devoted most of his efforts in determining way in which the child's logic, reasoning, and other conceptual process develop and how these are reflected in the child's use of language. Developmental interactionist, as the name implies, assume that any factors, that is maybe social, linguistic, maturational, biological, cognitive, etc., affect the course of development and that these factors are mutually dependent on, interact with, and modify one another. Not only do cognitive or social factors modify language acquisition, but language acquisition in turn modifies the development of cognitive and social skills, as said by Vygotsky in 1932. For Piaget, all cognitive acquisition, including language, is the outcome of a gradual process of construction. The child is gradually able to make greater sense of the world and is constantly constructing new levels of cognitive organization as he or she matures. These cognitive structures allow one to arrive at concepts, to solve problems, and to draw conclusions without necessarily being aware of these operations. These cognitive structures must be taken to explain language structures as well as their acquisition, since acquisition is logically prior to language in the human species. Language for Piaget is not a separate innate characteristic, but in fact only one of the several abilities that result from cognitive maturation. Language is structured by region. Basic linguistic developments are seen to be derived from even more basic general changes in cognition. For Piaget, the complex structure of language are neither innate nor learned. Instead, they emerge as a result of the continuing interaction between the child's current level of cognitive functioning and his or her current linguistic and non-linguistic environment. Piaget compares intellectual development in embryological development. Just as in embryology, interaction results in the growth or the increased complexity of the bodily organs and functions. So also, as the child continues to cope with his or her environment, his or her mental process become more and more complex. Piaget divides the interaction between the child and his or her environment into two phases. Number one, assimilation. When he or she takes in something from the environment, where the environment acts as the stimulus and the child responds with the response he or she has already acquired. But this is not sufficient. The child needs to cope with a changing and constantly expanding environment as he or she grows into an adult. This coping involves reorganizing of his or her thinking to develop new patterns of responses, which Piaget calls schemata. In effect, the child must change old into new schemata. Now, second one, accommodation. This defines the process of reorganizing schemata in ways that allow the child to cope more fully with his or her environment. The process of reorganizing is probably continuous, but it is generally described as occurring in stages and substages. Piaget listed more, I mean, important and stages which are called as four main stages which children pass through in their cognitive development. The first stage is the sensory motor stage from birth to about 24 months. When children understand their environment mainly by acting on it. Through touch and sight, children begin to understand basic relationships which affect them and objects in their experience and environment. These include space, location of objects, etc. But children cannot yet make use of abstract concepts. The next three stages are a movement towards more abstract processes. During the pre-operational stage, children develop a symbolic system which includes such skills as language, mental imagery, and drawing. Children also begin to develop the mental ability to use concepts dealing with the number, classification, order, and time, but use these concepts in a simple way. The next one, the concrete operational stage, that is 7 to 11 years. And earlier one, what we have discussed, that is, as I told you, the accommodation, assimilation, and how Piaget has divided his the interaction between the child and his environment. So, in that same manner, during the pre-operation, that is the pre-operation stage from around 2 to 7 years, whereas the concrete operation stage between 7 to 11 years. Children begin to use mental operations and acquire a number of concepts and conversation. During the formal operation stage, around 11 onwards, children are able to deal with abstract concepts and make hypotheses, inferences, and deductions. So, in total, the Piaget approach suggests that language is only an expression of a more general set of human cognitive activities. Proper development of the cognitive system is considered a necessary precursor of linguistic expression. The major task of the developmental interactionist then is to identify the sequence of cognitive maturation and to explain how these cognitive developments are reflected in language acquisition. So that is about the language development and how the language development takes place. We have seen the behaviorist learning theories, the mentalist and the procedural approach, the developmental interactionist approach. It is essential for an English teacher to understand these theories approaches because they have influenced second language acquisition theories as well as teaching methodologies. So also all these theories give an insight into the language learning process of the learner. So to that extent, it helps you to understand how the language acquisition takes place and how our student will do better in language acquisition. We will stop here, and that is the end of unit 9. So please wear the mask and maintain the social distance, and don't uh, forget to subscribe the channel. Okay, and you may make use of this information in the future. Thank you and all. Thank you.